I'm young adult librarian Ed Fuquay here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
Children's assistant, Solitaire Frisbee.
And in honor of this summer's summer reading program theme, which is fairy tales, mythology, and fantasy, we're here to have part 2 of our epic discussion about fantasy books. What do you think of fantasy books?
I'm absolutely intrigued. So while I am not super young anymore, I did not have any experience with Harry Potter until the last 6 months or so, and fell in love. So,
Yeah.
Good rolling start.
Yes, Harry Potter is a good example of modern fantasy. We'll get to him soon, if we have time. Last time we broke down different types of fantasy. These are very broad categories. A lot of things won't necessarily fit into exactly a category. The first one is high fantasy or epic fantasy, which is your large scale, like Lord of the Rings type stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Lord of the Rings has been hugely popular. Tolkien was pretty much responsible for creating the modern fantasy genre, for better or worse.
I did catch that series.
Yes.
Yeah, saw that.
Tolkien created a huge world with a sweeping story, a bunch of different races interacting with each other. So that was a very big deal when it came out. It's still the mark by which fantasies are judged in a lot of ways.
Now, in our last talk, if I remember right, you compared Tolkien to the author of The Lion, the Witch,
Narnia, the Narnia series, yes. C.S. Lewis.
C.S. Lewis.
Yes.
So in the same way that C.S. Lewis, he had a lot of symbolism.
Mm-hmm.
Is it your opinion that Tolkien in this series did as well, or was it just purely fantastical thinking?
I think that Tolkien was using fantasy to represent the human condition.
Okay.
He wants you to identify with the characters as like real people who are doing real things, which is why he put so much work into the universe. So you care about them, you worry about them, and that way when there's suspense going on, it's actually you get the feeling that they could actually die.
Okay.
And he does in fact kill off several characters in the course of the series. So, but it's basically, there's several different ways of looking at Lord of the Rings. In some ways it's an idyllic version of the England that used to be. In a way, it's like the Shire was sort of a pre-industrial England when everyone lived in like an agricultural setting and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the theme of Lord of the Rings is that time moves on and everything changes.
Okay.
By the end of Lord of the Rings, you get the idea that we're leaving that age of myth and entering more an age of history, an age when human beings, rather than elves and hobbits, will play like the major role in things that happens.
Okay.
This can be seen as like the fading way of the way things used to work.
So Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, were they in any way competitors?
They were friends, so I'm not sure if they were really competitive or not. The big difference between them was that C.S. Lewis was famously very Catholic.
Okay.
And he used Catholicism as the backbone for his entire Narnia series. Everything that's symbolic in Narnia is symbolic of things that have to do with Catholicism.
Mm-hmm.
Aslan is Jesus, in case people didn't figure it out. Which was always funny when like the Disney Corporation tried to do the adaptations. They didn't want to make it overly religious, even though technically that's the entire point of the Narnia series. Tolkien was convinced that you could do a fantasy series that doesn't rely on that kind of symbolism as your background, and so he did. He created a universe partly out of whole cloth, partly out of old myths. He was an expert in medieval folk tales and Norse mythology and things like that. So he borrowed things from several different sources to come up with his distinct universe.
Folktales, do they fall under this category as well, or was that a separate category?
Folktales are kind of a separate category. Folktales are fantasy stories for the most part. Most of them are like set in a specific area involving a specific group of people, so some of them are kind of localized.
Okay.
They also don't have like a fully developed characters a lot of times. Things happen. Folktales are stories that have morals sometimes, and sometimes they're just amusing anecdotes that happen to various people. You don't often see a plot that has more than 2 or 3 incidents in it, or a character that undergoes too much of a change as the story progresses. folktales are definitely a part of this.
Okay.
A subset of like high fantasy is the sword and sorcery. Conan by Robert E. Howard, Elric of Melniboné by Michael Moorcock are the two best examples. I had a Conan book last week. I don't have an Elric book. We don't have any in the library right now. Elric was created as kind of the exact polar opposite of Conan. Conan is a big, brawny, tough, sun-bronzed guy, and Robert E. Howard is a very distinctive writer. He writes very vividly, and the Conan stories are fun to read, but to a certain extent, Conan reminded me of the guys that beat me up in school.
Okay.
Whereas Elric reminds me more of me. He's skinny, he's weak, he's sickly all the time. The only reason why he becomes an epic hero is the fact that he has a magic sword, Stormbringer, a sword that is fantastically powerful but also cursed.
Okay.
So he's involved in a struggle between order and chaos in a fantasy universe, and his sword inevitably brings him victory but also great tragedy in the end. He's part of an epic cycle of the eternal hero that Michael Moorcock has been writing about his entire life since like the 1960s.
The eternal hero.
The eternal hero is reincarnated again and again, and Elric is only one aspect of the eternal hero.
So it's more a concept?
Yeah. All across the multiverse in different realities, different people become the hero of that universe.
Is there an underlying message that's connected?
It's mostly order versus chaos, trying to bring stability into a world that just doesn't make sense.
Okay.
And Moorcock is also a big comic book fan, and so he had the inevitable crossover where his characters team up. Characters go from one universe to another to meet each other. Yeah, so you can spend like years and years reading Moorcock stuff. He's semi-retired now, he's had some health issues, but he's still turning out Elric stories.
Impressive.
Yeah, that's good stuff. So you have that, and you have low fantasy or magical realism, which seem like the same things to me, although some critics separate them into two. That's where you have a realistic story where there's a single magical element. Like one magical thing happens. Things like Weetzie-Bat, which is simultaneously set in a very real world by Francesca Leobloch. It's set in a real world, it's set in Los Angeles, but it's also set in La La Land, a fantasy world. So it's both realistic and a fantasy at the same time. Like Water for Chocolate is the book that always comes up when you Google magical realism.
Mm-hmm.
Which is a story about a woman who has the power to put her emotions into the food that she cooks for people,
Mm-hmm.
for both good or ill. It's a very tragic story. And then urban fantasy is where you have a universe that is our world, but it's infused with magic. There's more than just one magical element. It's what separates magical realism from urban fantasy. Some urban fantasy can be high urban fantasy, where there's all kinds of monsters and demons and things running around. And it can be like more things where the universe is mostly like us, our universe, where you have certain magical elements in it. The important thing with urban fantasy is the magic has to be an intrinsic part of that world. Even if it's hidden from the humanity at large, it's still an important part of that world. Now, I said we barely scratched the surface last time, and it's so true.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I wanted to mention was Dungeons and Dragons. Fantasy is by far the largest genre for role-playing games. Certainly tabletop role-playing games all take their cue from Dungeons and Dragons. Computer role-playing games that are now hugely popular all began taking off things from tabletop games. So Dungeons and Dragons, although it started the whole concept of a role-playing game, that eventually morphed into computer RPGs.
Is there any discrepancy that Dungeons and Dragons, in fact, was the original? I mean, was there any other?
There's no doubt.
No doubt.
Yes.
Okay.
Until Gary Gygax and a couple of his friends invented Dungeons and Dragons, no one ever really thought of that before.
Okay.
The idea had been floating around, but no one had ever actually written a game and set down rules. Basically, a role-playing game, a tabletop role-playing game, is basically like playing make-believe when you're a kid.
Mm-hmm.
I described it once for my regular D&D I used to have here at the library. I described it to an adult once as, it's like storytelling, but it's for older people, and you also are a character in the story.
Okay.
So you have someone, the dungeon master for Dungeons and Dragons, who basically has an adventure, either a pre-written one or one he's come up with himself, and the characters in that story are the people sitting around the table, and they decide the course of the action. And you write things that happen, but it's the players who decide where they go, what they do, who do they talk to, what they say to them. So things you've written, clever things you've written can go entirely off rail. People go around randomly. Dungeons and Dragons was cribbed very heavily on Tolkien when it first began. Less so since there was some legal action. They borrowed from a lot of different sources. Tolkien is a big part of it. Basically, the idea of a fantasy world in which humans, elves, dwarves, and halflings are all intelligent species. Humans are human, and the rest of them are their own race. And so they interact with each other. They each have their own society. They each have their own way of looking at the world, but they all live in the same universe, rubbing shoulders with each other. I have, this is my earliest Dungeons & Dragons book here at the library. I forget exactly what year this came out, but this is an early itineration of the rules. There's been several different rule sets for Dungeons & Dragons. The latest one, I believe, is the 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, which I have that here in my reference section. There's a ton of rules, but you don't need to know any of them to enjoy Dungeons & Dragons. You can play it without the rule books if you want to. When you're doing a role-playing game, you can really do it in any genre that you want. Dungeons & Dragons has just become the most popular.
Does Dungeons and Dragons have an associated card, like a deck of cards, like Yu-Gi-Oh or Pokemon?
Kind of, sort of. They put out a deck of cards associated with the game that are like props to use in the game.
In the game.
But the people that own Dungeons & Dragons right now, well, technically it's Hasbro, but the people that owned it before Hasbro were Wizards of the Coast, and they became very big with Magic cards. That was their claim to fame. So the people that run Magic cards also control Dungeons & Dragons right now.
So are those two similar in?
Weirdly, no. Wizards of the Coast is coming out with supplements set in their universe they've created for Magic cards, because Magic cards are their own magical universe.
Okay.
And it doesn't really cross over with Dungeons & Dragons, but using the rule set they created for Dungeons & Dragons, they're doing tabletop adventures set in the universe of the Magic cards.
What are the main differences between the two, Dungeons & Dragons and Magic?
I don't play Magic, so I don't know that much about it. It involves planewalkers that go from one reality to another. And they have different sets of cards, they have different themes to them based on the different realities that they go into.
Cards?
Cards.
Oh,
yes.
Card.
The magic cards.
Okay.
The different sets have different themes based on like what universe this particular story is set in. They have one that's set in a universe similar to ancient Egypt, and so everything in there has like pyramids and Egyptian gods in it and things like that. A recent supplement involved Aztecs riding dinosaurs in like a South America type setting with vampires. So it had a lot of cool things in it, but they're not stories. They're a game you play, a strategy game involving like deck building, coming up with a set of cards you play.
Okay, so that's one main difference, is it's not story-based.
Yeah, Dungeons & Dragons and all like tabletop role-playing are story-based. You have an adventure you're going on, and you're the hero of that adventure, or the villain sometimes, depending on what happens. This allows people to actually be a part of a fantasy universe.
Right.
In a small way, you can actually be a character in a fantasy world.
Well, in fact, I am one in my husband's game on Xbox.
Cool.
A couple games, actually, yeah.
It was Dungeons & Dragons that led to the creation of computer role-playing games.
Okay.
Although computer games are a separate genre, and they've now expanded out into like a huge field. So you can find computer games in almost any genre as well. However, there are still some, like Dragon Age, for example, that still very strongly mirror that, like the Dungeons and Dragons kind of way of looking at the world.
So, did you say that this was high fantasy?
It would be high fantasy, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, if you're interested in Dungeons and Dragons, find someone that already plays. You don't need to know any of the rules really to start playing unless you want to be a dungeon master. And it's very hard to start out just being a dungeon master. It's easy to start out as a player.
Okay.
So fantasy. My favorite urban fantasy author is someone that I didn't get a chance to talk about last time, who is Neil Gaiman. His name will come up again as we start talking about mythology. Neil Gaiman is a writer from England originally. He became famous for a couple of things. He's written the book Good Omens with Terry Pratchett, recently made into a TV miniseries. And he worked on a comic book called Sandman for DC's Vertigo imprint for a long time. And Sandman became hugely popular. It involves these immortal characters who represent various like concepts, and they all start with the letter D in English for some odd reason. The Sandman himself is Dream, and you also have Death, Desire, Destruction, and so forth and so on, Delirium. And they're both characters in their own right, and they represent the concepts that their name implies.
Okay.
So it's a fascinating story and a really interesting look at a universe. I consider Sandman to be an urban fantasy because it is set largely in a real world. Technically, it's set in the world of the DC universe because Sandman has crossed over with other DC characters a couple of times.
Okay.
But being a Vertigo imprint, he was under no obligation to like force superheroes into a story. Even though when he does use superheroes, it's always a really fascinating story. He left DC, went on to become a fantasy author in his own right. He's been very successful at that.
So he's still writing?
He's still writing, yeah, he's still doing a lot of good stuff. His American Gods is one that we'll talk about when we do more mythology-based things. American Gods and Anansi Boys, the companion novel.
Wait, I'm intrigued. American Gods.
Yes.
Do you know one? Can you reveal at least one?
Yes, it deals with basically the old concept of gods that are still hanging around our world even though they're not worshipped anymore.
Oh, such as?
Well, an ex-con gets out of jail and discovers that his wife has betrayed him and is dead. She was not only cheating on him, but now she's dead, so he can't really do anything about that. So he's full of lots of angst and no place to put his tremendous emotions. So he runs into a strange guy who hires him to like drive his car in this epic road trip across country. But he encounters like more and more magical things that don't make a whole lot of sense. And it gradually dawns on him that the guy who's like leading around by the nose is actually a very old trickster god. It's in fact a version of Odin, the Norse god.
Okay.
And even our hero himself, who appears pretty normal in the beginning, handles himself pretty well against some magical opponents and begins to realize that he's more than he thinks he is too. Gaiman does a lot of really clever things with the concept, including the idea there are different versions of the gods, and the book is specifically called American Gods.
Right.
And that these are, in a sense, the American viewpoint of the ancient gods. Odin is active only in America because the Vikings settled here at one time. Even though they've been gone for a long time and there are no Viking cultures.
That's a cool train of thought.
It's
okay.
it's really amazing what he does with it. Anansi Boys is set in the same universe as American God. They don't cross over or anything, but it's both the same concept. A guy in England discovers that he's actually the son of Anansi, the African trickster god. And that the weird things that are happening in his life actually weren't hallucinations. He actually has been having weird, ridiculous things happen to him his entire life. And how he copes with that is the story of Anansi Boys.
Okay.
The one that I brought to show is Neverwhere by Gaiman. It's in a lot of ways it's my favorite book of all time. When I had the time, I would read it like about once a year. It's the classic like fantasy story of a hero who falls into another universe. And in this case, it's a universe that literally exists alongside the real world.
So I'm noticing a map here.
Oh yes, that's the London Underground. That's
the
truth.
actual.
Yes, that is. You can actually like cross London following like the chapters of the book.
Okay.
Because it's set in London below, which is literally below London.
Okay.
And it's set in all the abandoned like steam tunnels and not steam tunnels in England. It's set in abandoned tunnels and old like hidden railway tracks and unused subway stations and so forth that are all the homes to these magical characters.
Wow. So again, all factual information here. This diagram.
Oh yeah, it's what he's done is he's recreated a mirror universe down below, in which things that are not real in our world are real in the other world. He has to go on an epic quest across London, basically.
Would he have
on the subway?
Had to acquire copyright?
Not for a map of the underground.
Okay.
They give those things away pretty freely in London.
Okay.
But things basically like Blackfriars Station, which is it's a regular tube stop in London. But when our hero goes there, of course, it's inhabited by friars, a religious order, who are all dressed in these black robes,
Yep.
who present a challenge that he has to overcome. The Knightsbridge station, it actually has to cross a bridge that has a knight on it and has to be defeated.
Very cool.
Gaiman was very worried that young people would read this book and believe that people living in the sewers actually had wonderful magical lives. And so hopefully no one really left their home and went to live in a sewer because of this. Because he very explicitly points out some of the issues involved with this. It is a fantasy. It has lots of cool characters, lots of great setups. Gaiman's the kind of writer who has such a vivid imagination. He has ideas that are just brilliant, and he sort of tosses them aside without using them because he has so many other ideas he needs to put out there. At one point, our hero runs across a bunch of Roman soldiers from back when the place was called Londinium. And another character explains, but there's so much time in London, it doesn't all get used up. Which is a really fascinating idea. He never goes back to it again, though. That's the kind of writer Neil Gaiman is.
Right. Neil Gaiman.
Yes, there's also a TV miniseries based on it.
Really?
Yeah, it was made with a budget that it probably could have used more money, but it has the advantage of being actually shot on location underneath of London.
Where do you find it?
It's on DVD. I'm not sure if the library carries it or not. I should have looked that up, but it's not that hard to find.
The title of it?
It's Neverwhere.
Okay.
He wrote the book and the screenplay at the same time.
Okay.
There's lots of things, like London used to have a postal delivery system that was railroad cars that were at smaller than normal height that would carry mail across London. At one time, London actually had 6 mail deliveries a day. It was like texting. Really? Yeah, you could write a letter. Yeah, Sherlock Holmes could write a letter and send it off, get a response an hour later in the mail. Yeah, it was crazy. But of course, the miniature trains are still there.
Wow.
And he talks about them in the book, and they actually use some of them in the TV series Neverwhere.
Very cool.
It's mostly filmed in abandoned subway stops, the entire series. So it's really very well done. It's highly recommended. Yes,
Gaiman.
if you want a taste of urban fantasy, Neil Gaiman is pretty much the best. So I have genres that I haven't even gotten to yet. There is historic fantasy. Can you guess what that is?
Like Abraham Lincoln Vampire Slayer?
Yes, I should have grabbed that one, but I didn't though. Somehow I didn't think of that one. Yes, Abraham Lincoln Vampire Slayer is a very good example of that. It's set in a historic setting. It involves real people, but it's a pure fantasy.
Okay.
So this is like a fantasy.
Are you sure?
Yeah. It's high fantasy in a historic setting, usually. I want to ask you, Solitaire, how many times have you asked yourself, what would the Napoleonic Wars be like if they were fought with dragons?
I've had many, many thoughts. I can't say that was one of them.
Yeah, I know. Fortunately, Naomi Novik did think about that. She wrote the book, His Majesty's Dragon, which is literally the wars between England and Napoleon fought with dragons.
And it even entertained Stephen King.
Yep, Stephen King loved it.
All right.
It's an option for film by Peter Jackson. There's still no film on the horizon. It's too bad. The writer certainly should be more well known than she is. The books are very well written. Strong characters. They start out with a very simple premise that they ride the dragons into battle and they fight. And the dragons are intelligent and they want to cooperate with humans and they want to fight. But as the books progress, it's obvious that this is really a form of slave labor.
It's not even a far cry though, because weren't elephants used in the same manner?
Exactly, elephants are used in the exact same manner.
So if there was a world that actually existed that
Yeah.
had dragons, they probably would have been used.
Yep. The hero is a guy who is a ship's captain. He's very much like, Master and Commander from that whole series of books. However, they come across a French ship which has a dragon egg on board, which it actually sees for England. And the egg hatches, and the baby dragon bonds with our hero, the captain of the ship.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't want to leave his ship and become a dragon rider, but he kind of has to because there's so few people that can control the dragons. Now that he's bonded with the dragon, he has to go train with it.
That's a completely logical thought.
Yep. And Temeraire the dragon starts out being very subservient to our hero and gets more and more independent as time goes on. We also travel around the world. We find other kinds of dragons exist. They go to China at one point, which is the home of numerous exotic dragons. Africa, with its own mythology. It's tremendous world building.
Do dragons exist in Africa's folklore?
Not technically, but things similar to them do.
So dragons are specific to Europe?
Dragons are specific to Europe and Asia, but they're very different kinds of dragons. Asian dragons tend to be water-based rather than fire-based. And the dragons are more benign in Asia. Chinese dragons are used as they put on the outside of buildings to protect them. Dragons are the protectors of the royal family of ancient China. They can be dangerous, of course, because they're big and powerful, but they're definitely seen as being more protectors. In Europe, dragons were under attack by the Catholic Church. So they had St. George, the patron saint of England, was famous for being a dragon slayer. Yeah. He was a Catholic saint who killed a dragon. He became patron saint of England over it. Dragons were associated with Satan, with like pure evil. There are versions of dragons that appear in like Greek mythology that don't have that evil connotation to them. But basically like strange monsters that can't really be explained or don't really fall into normal taxonomy have been around for a long time in Europe. And it all became codified as dragons. They became the dragons that we know from folklore with scales and wings, and they breathe fire and so forth. They were generally associated with evil in the Middle Ages, and that got less and less appropriate as time went on. So this is a version of dragons in the Napoleonic War, the Temeraire series.
Okay.
I am a young adult librarian, so I have lots of stuff involving young adult type books in my section. That is the most popular genre in the young adult period right now is fantasy. The most famous, of course, is Harry Potter. I didn't even bring any Harry Potter books to show because they're everywhere and everyone has heard about them for the most part.
They're in my house, actually.
Yes, they're great books. She has fantastic world building. It's, I guess, technically urban fantasy. I was discussing this just like earlier. It's urban fantasy in the sense that Harry Potter himself is raised in a very ordinary, mundane world.
Right.
But the books are almost entirely set in a magical setting. He spends very little time with the Dursleys, in fact, less and less time as the books progress.
Right.
He mostly lives in a purely magical world, so it has the feel of an epic fantasy or an high fantasy, even though technically he still interacts with the real world. But it's a world that's hidden by the masquerade, so the humans can never really know how much magic there is in the world. So other things in that genre, the urban fantasy genre, Holly Black. She's a brilliant writer. Tithe is one of her like big books. She wrote a series of stories set involving fairies in the modern day world. Tithe involves the old view of fairies as being magical beings who are beautiful and powerful and dangerous, and you probably don't want to mess with them. It's about a young woman who discovers that her absentee father that she's never met actually turns out he was a fairy. She discovers this and wings start sprouting from her back. So she has to have that awkward conversation with her mother. Yeah, and she also, now that she's aware that it's a magical world, she tries to find her way in the world of fairy, where the rules of conduct are very different than the human world. The hardcover version of this has a sort of a punk-looking girl in a leather jacket with like fairy wings bursting out of the back of it.
Okay.
Like Tinkerbell on the skids, sort of.
So, like, what are the two main ways that the world is different? The fairy world.
In the fairy world, mistakes can get you killed.
Oh.
Things that you say offhand become a bond that you have to live the rest of your life with. You can make an oath about something when you even would just be like casually talking about it. So a fairy has its own rules and regulations. There's one of the rules is if you're in fairy, you never eat any food. If you eat the food of fairy, you can never leave. You're trapped there forever. That goes way back. It's part of the Persephone myth that we'll get to when we discuss Greek mythology. She was taken away by Hades and couldn't leave and go back to the surface world because she'd eaten like 3 pomegranate seeds, which wasn't enough to keep her in the underworld forever, but she had to stay in the underworld for part of the year with Hades.
Okay.
So eating the food of fairy is a bad idea. If you accept a gift from someone in fairy, you have to give them something back of equal value in return.
Okay.
So you have the rule of obligation. And there's probably more, because I haven't researched it, these are all off the top of my head. But fairy tales, these rules generally come from Celtic mythology, which inform most of our feelings about fairies or the Sidhe, S-I-D-H-E. There's a lot of very elaborate rules for how to conduct themselves, but basically you're held accountable for your actions in the Fae realm.
So wait a minute. So is Celtic specific to, would it be Ireland, Wales, and Scotland combined, or?
Yes, we think of it that way today. The Celts as a people were all across Northern Europe.
Okay.
But the only remains of Celtic culture is basically Ireland and some in Scotland, Wales.
Okay.
We can do an entire discussion about that if you want.
And fairies, again, they're specific to that area? Do they not pop up in other cultures or areas of the world?
Yes and no. Different parts of England and the British Isles have their own fairy legends, and they call them by different names, and some of them have different attributes. But for the most part, they're very, very similar.
That's still sort of in the same area. So if you go out towards, the Middle East or
the Middle East
Asia,
is a whole different thing.
Africa.
They don't have any fairies in the Middle East. They have jinn.
Is that an equivalent?
In some ways, yes. The jinn are magical beings.
Like a genie?
Yes, as in genie. The jinn were another race like the human race. They were created by Allah. And they have free will, so a genie doesn't have to be evil. They can choose to do good or ill in the world. Some of them, the most powerful ones, have magic powers, but their powers are restricted by certain rules they have to follow. They're capable of being very evil, but they can also be good. They can also, interestingly, interbreed with humans, so they're human jinn like hybrids in the Middle East.
Really?
According to legend, that's absolutely true.
Okay, but that is, to me, still different from fairies. So do you see fairies in any other countries or continent, Africa? Or...
Magical people, different races of people, exist everywhere in the world.
But specifically fairies?
The fairies are specifically in like England, Scotland, Ireland, the Manx Isles and things like that.
That's interesting.
What we call fairies. There's a lot of places that had legends about little people. The Native Americans had these like tiny little people that ran around and did things. Polynesian mythology also has a tribe of little people. In Africa, they have the Wakayambi, I believe, which are people who have tails like monkeys who live in the trees. And they can grant wishes or or help you out heroes sometimes, or sometimes play pranks on you and so forth like that. They're as intelligent as humans and they're physically very beautiful, but they live in trees and have magic powers.
Cool.
So they're often lumped in with fairies.
What are they called again?
I think Wakayambi, but I'm doing that totally from memory.
Okay.
Before I talk about other cultures, I should research how to pronounce words. I don't want to insult anyone out there.
You're doing your best.
I know. Do you want to do an entire discussion about fairies?
Why not?
It fits into this category, definitely. I can go into more detail and learn how to pronounce things.
Sure.
Especially like, Welsh words that have like no vowels to them. Fantasy books, we have like so much more to talk about. I'll go very quickly run down other things. Vampires are hugely popular with teens. The vampire books that appeal to the YA market are generally, I don't consider them horror books. I consider them to be like fantasy books. They're urban fantasy. They're virtually all set in a real world where vampires are real. Sometimes there are also like werewolves and zombies and things like that in the same universe. But it's mostly urban fantasy with a specific focus on vampires. There's a lot of them out there. The Percy Jackson series we'll be talking about at length when we discuss mythology. Percy Jackson is a teen whose father turns out to be Poseidon, the Greek god. It involves him in all kinds of adventures. One of my all-time favorite fantasy series is The Alchemist by Michael Scott. It's a fantastic series involving Nicholas Flamel and his wife Perenelle. Nicholas Flamel is famously the discoverer of the Philosopher's Stone. He is mentioned, he's name dropped several times in the Harry Potter series, and he appears as a character in the recent Fantastic Beasts movies. He had an emerald tablet that allowed him to discover the secret of the Philosopher's Stone to make himself immortal. He was a powerful sorcerer, as was his wife Perenelle. And he was an actual person who lived. His house still is in Paris, I believe, so you can visit it. So he was a real person who did things. He wrote books that are still available. But in the magical world, he was a lot more than that. Michael Scott does a lot of fantastic world building, dealing with the concept of a group of immortals who are vying for power against each other. And many of the immortals are actually like people who are worshipped as gods. So they have incredible powers. And some of them are people like Nicholas Flamel who have become immortal through the Philosopher's Stone or various other means. John Dee, Elizabeth I's court alchemist, is the villain of a lot of the books. And it involves several famous people from history who were made immortal, who become allies or enemies of the heroes. The heroes of the books is a pair of twins. And there's a prophecy about twins, one of which will save the world and one of which will doom the world. And Nicholas Flamel believes that he's got these twins of prophecy and will use them to manipulate things to come out the way he wants it to. But other people want different outcomes. And the two teenagers don't really want to be manipulated. And they're not even certain if they are the twins of prophecy until relatively late in the series. It's got a lot of great stuff in it. Joan of Arc is one of the immortals. They've got the Celtic goddess Scathach, who also appears. My favorite scene was when Billy the Kid and the philosopher Nietzsche team up to save San Francisco from the Kraken. Mm-hmm. Because, yeah. Seeing an immortal Billy the Kid team up with a German philosopher to fight a sea monster is,
There you go.
Doesn't get better than that, really. It's a fantastic series. It's written for a YA audience, but Chris, my boss, and I were both reading them as they came out. And it is a lot of amazing things with time travel and prophecy and things like that. And everything that's prophesized at one point in the book does in fact happen. But exactly how it happens, we don't know. Mm-hmm. It's really well done. There's also a terrific series. I've finally gotten a full set of them. Skullduggery Pleasant. Fantastic world building. A girl's uncle dies, and she knows her uncle wrote fantasy books, and she's always liked her uncle. In fact, she was the only one in the family that her uncle really got along with her uncle, who was considered a little crazy. Turns out he was more than a little crazy. He was actually part of a magical underground who were fighting to defend the earth from these faceless, nameless monstrosities who want to take over and destroy everything. And her uncle's best friend was Skullduggery Pleasant, who's a walking skeleton who hurls fireballs and makes a lot of wisecracks.
You can see how that might make one crazy.
So since she's inherited her uncle's legacy, Skullduggery takes her under his wing and teaches her the ways of magic. Oh. Which winds up being more complicated and more dangerous than she could ever have imagined.
She's like teenager?
She's a teenager, yeah.
Okay.
She's a great character. Skullduggery is a fantastic character. Has a tragic backstory. He suffers from a horrible curse, which is why he's literally a walking skeleton. Oh. It's a great series. It wasn't that popular when it first came out, and so several of them were only available in England. And I managed to score some of them, and I had almost a complete set, and I managed to buy the rest of them from Amazon UK for the library. So we have a full set of the first set, Skullduggery Pleasant stories. He's popular enough in England, there's actually a book on his second cycle of stories. And most of the earliest Skullduggery Pleasants have come out in America, finally. Highly recommended by Derek Landy, Skullduggery Pleasant, and the Alchemist series by Michael Scott. That's all the time we have. We will do fairies next week.
Beautiful.
Yes, I'm very excited about that. Mm-hmm. So I'll join you next time. I've been Ed.
Solitaire.
Take care of yourselves, be safe, and we'll see you all again next time.